It is getting close to 5:30, and thank you very much everybody for bearing with us that logged in a little bit earlier. But it's great that we waited as we've grown our participants to this webinar, focusing on sugar, a very important area and a very important area of discussion, which is going to form the basis of the next 1 hour and 15 minutes or 1 hour 30 minutes with some outstanding speakers. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the land on which we are meeting, which for me is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Essendon, where I'm based at the moment, and also recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as original owners and custodian of the lands and the waterways across the continent, and especially where Melbourne University is. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the academy as a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students. I can say that we are privileged to work and learn every day with our Indigenous colleagues and partners. And I pay my respects to all the Indigenous and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that will be joining us on this webinar today. I am Professor Alistair Sloan. I'm a bioscientist, but I'm also here as the head of Melbourne Dental School. I'm chairing and coordinating this webinar this evening. And then we have 4 excellent speakers to talk to us about the problems that we have around sugar. Sugar really was once an occasional treat. I think back to my childhood, it was an occasional treat with my mother, who was very, very careful in what I had and what I wasn't allowed to have. But actually, it's now become the dominance, actually, in a lot of our foodstuffs. And dominance of sugar in processed foods and drinks has caused this treat to become quite a threat to many aspects of our health, including, and quite damagingly, our oral health. And this webinar will explore our changing relationship with sugar, how it's affected our oral and dental health, and the push for positive change, which is the important thing here. As I say, we have 4 great speakers for you this evening. In order of speaking, we have representing a member of the Indigenous Dental Association of Australia and proud Worimi woman, Kelly Gleeson, who's joining us, and welcome, Kelly, to this. Delighted to have you here speaking this evening. We have from the Melbourne Dental School, Dr. Rita Hardiman, who is speaking to us today, and also from Melbourne University, but from the School of Global and Population Health, Professor Rob Moody. And finally, wrapping up our speakers is Associate Professor Matt Hopcraft, an expert and background in dental public health. We have a tight schedule. Kelly is our first speaker, who is up first. What will happen is we've got our speakers will talk. I will introduce each one as we go along, and then hopefully there will be a really good Q&A and a discussion at the end of this webinar. I hope you enjoy. It is a hot topic, a very important topic for oral health. And Kelly, I will hand it over to you as our first speaker this evening.
Thank you, Alistair. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Kelly Gleeson, and I'll be presenting a lecture on Indigenous Australian relationship with sugar and oral health. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all on today and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So with this map, I just wanted to show the multitude of different traditional clan groups. And it's important to recognise that all clans are different. They have different customs, languages, as well as diet. And today I am on the Wabikal land, which is in Newcastle, New South Wales. And I'd like you all to reflect on the First Nations group whose land you are on today and respect your own and extend your own respects. So a little bit about me. So I am a proud Worimi woman, and my ancestors were based along the New South Wales coast in Port Stephens. They grew up on a mission called Kurua, New South Wales, which traditionally means place of native plum tree. My ancestors were known as saltwater people and remembered as great fishermen and boat builders. My Nana Violet used to tell stories and speak fondly of her and her siblings running along the riverbank, gathering oysters and crab hunting. I am also an oral health therapist with Adult Scope, and I currently work in public in New South Wales Health on the Central Coast, as well as Yeren Eleanor Duncan Dental Services, which treats the local Indigenous Darkinjung area. I am also on the Australian Dental Council Committee, representing a voice for Indigenous community. I'd also like to comment that these photos are ethically sourced, or I have permission for. Some are actually family, so nieces and nephews. And throughout the presentation, I will refer to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as First Nation peoples, as well as Indigenous Australians. So what we'll cover in today's lecture: traditional First Nations people relationship with sugar and oral health, a brief explanation of colonisation impacts, modern First Nations relationships with sugar and oral health and their barriers, as well as our role as preventive dental clinicians. And finally, I'll give you some examples on some really good First Nations resources. So let's begin. Prior to colonisation, evidence shows that dental disease, including caries and periodontal disease, were uncommon in the First Nations population. And in fact, they had overall superior oral health in comparison to the European counterpart. First Nations people historically consumed a diet comprising mostly of plants, animals, and fish, but it varied greatly. So remember all those different clan groups. So throughout Australia and Torres Strait, with islands and coastal areas, those areas traditionally had seafood and crabs and fish and turtle, where those more inland had a variety of plants, fruits, seeds, eggs, small mammals and animals, and insects. So both men and women were involved in food collection, with men hunting the bigger game lean meat, including kangaroo, wallaby, emu, and crocodile. So as we can see, the traditional diet had very low sugar, and with unprocessed food that required lengthy and vigorous mastication. This in turn promotes healthy saliva production, which assisted in keeping their oral cavities clean. So some foods did have natural sugars, including honey and nectar. However, these were very difficult to obtain and they were considered a luxury. Also, Indigenous Australians had access to fresh water supplies and were known to be nomadic, walking over lengthy distances, which contributed positively to their oral health and overall well-being. So additionally, Indigenous culture also encompassed more of a holistic view with bush medicines, and they even had a plant that they juiced and crushed up to treat toothaches, known as the hot bush. So after European colonisation in 1788, enforced policies stripped rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This allowed government policies to dictate and control all aspects of their lives, including where they could live, where they could work, who they could marry, and what they could eat. So as Europeans found customs to be barbaric, First Nations people were prevented in hunting and gathering for their nutritious and low sugar foods. So First Nations people then became dependent on European introduced foods, including milk, tea, jam, flour and sugar, and tinned meats. And their diets on their mission were very lacking. So in fresh fruit and vegetables, they were deficient in vitamin A, C, and folate, as well as calcium. Although they had different accesses to different things, it's also important to emphasize the impacts of massacres, dispossession, loss of freedom, and intergenerational trauma on the overall well-being of the First Nations people. With their rights stripped, they had an inability to practice or pass on kinship and cultural connections. And this is something that is most sacred for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And these impacts are still having major roles in First Nations lives today. So it's only been over 55 years that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been counted as Australian citizens with the 1967 referendum. At the time, my dad would have been 6 years old and my nan would have been in her early 20s, and they still didn't have any basic human rights. So it would be fair to say, though most of these events are still historical in nature, they're very current. So what does the modern First Nation relationship with oral health look like? So as we've revised, we know that oral self-care behaviours were not a part of traditional Indigenous Australian lifestyle. They had low sugar and unprocessed diet, and this allowed them to refrain from severe dental issues or complications. And as a part of oral health habits, such as brushing, they weren't ingrained in Indigenous communities. So modern attitudes towards the importance of this oral health in Indigenous population is lowered compared to the European counterparts. So here are some facts with the Australian Institution of Health and Welfare. So First Nations people are fourfold, so 4 times more likely to experience dental disease than non-Indigenous Australians. And we need to remember, so 4 times the prevalence, but only 3.2% of the Australian population. It's also reported that 6% of Indigenous Australians aged 15 and over had reported complete loss, and 45% had at least lost 1 tooth. So less than 5% of all remote Indigenous children brush their teeth. That doesn't mean every day. And they are 1.5 more times likely to attend hospital for dental issues than non-Indigenous Australians. And finally, there is a reported lack of understanding of oral hygiene and lower rates for dental appointments. And this is due to trust, costs, and embarrassment. And as we know, sugar plays a very impactful role on dental diseases. So what are the current recommendations of sugar in modern society? The World Health Organization recommends free sugar should be less than 10% of a daily kilojoule intake to prevent dental caries. So for a healthy adult with a healthy BMI, they can approximately have 12 teaspoons of sugar a day, whereas children 3 to 12, depending on BMI, can have a maximum of 6, and children 0 to 3 are recommended not to have any added sugar. So how do the recommendations compare to the current Indigenous Australian sugar intake? So I found a few facts. So First Nations peoples 2 years and older are consuming on average 18 teaspoons of sugar a day. So free sugars a day. So remember, sugars aren't recommended for 0 to 3 years, and the max for a child 3 and over is 6 teaspoons, and for a healthy adult, it's 12. So in most incidences, this is way more than 50% what the World Health Organization recommends. The majority of free sugars were consumed mostly from discretionary foods, with 2/3 just coming from sugary drinks. And finally, Australian teenage boys seem to have the biggest sweet intake, reportedly consuming a whopping 25 teaspoon sugars a day. So that's insane, the amount of sugar that's being consumed. So as we know, higher sugar levels and poor oral health contribute significantly to chronic diseases. So Indigenous Australians significantly have higher occurrence of diseases, including type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, kidney, respiratory disease, and these diseases directly affect good oral health outcomes as well as overall well-being. This is even more concerning, as 37% of the diseases are preventable through lifestyle changes. So if we can get people to reduce their sugar, their alcohol intake, tobacco, and increase physical activity. So Indigenous Australians also have an increased pregnancy complication, which heightens the occurrence of dental abnormalities such as enamel hyperplasia. And we know how much enamel hyperplasia affects our community, how hard it is to treat. With 74.6% of Indigenous children were found to have some sort of degrees of enamel hyperplasia. So that's more than 50%. And we know that enamel hyperplasia can in turn lead the risk to caries, sensitivity, and ultimately tooth loss. So why is this happening in modern Australia? So research shows that oral health of any population is influenced by the social determinants of health. So Indigenous Australians are known as a disadvantaged population with higher rates of lower socioeconomic status. So this significantly impacts First Nations people, so their ability to access basic shelter, water, food, education, and employment, let alone affording dental care products and dental services. And as we know, the basic cost of living is increasing. It's very hard for people to live at the moment, and sugary foods and drinks are representing the lowest cost options, sorry, and they're easily storable. So dental services and toothbrush and toothpaste may not be a priority for a family that's struggling just to afford the basics. In fact, so Indigenous Australians reported to be 1.5 times more likely to have difficulty paying a $100 dental bill compared to non-Indigenous Australians. And they also experience poorer housing and overcrowding conditions, with the majority not even satisfying the Australian standard requirement for shelter. So most households, or some households, actually toothbrushes don't exist, or they're shared. Even if they are shared, they don't have places to keep it clean. And we need to also just circle back to the effects of intergenerational trauma. So there's also a heightened risk of incidents in risky behaviour, such as smoking, drugs and alcohol use, which increases mental health issues. And we all know directly affects our oral health as well. So what are the barriers to oral health services for our First Nations population? So in a report from the Australian Health and Welfare Institute in 2020, it was estimated that 19% of Australians that were Indigenous reported that they did not go to a dentist in the last 12 months, even though they needed to. And reasons included cost, being too busy, disliking the service, feeling stereotyped, embarrassed or afraid, and the waiting times. Other main barriers that we know are widely researched to affect First Nations people's access also include feeling judged and stereotyped, lack of cultural sensitivity response training amongst staff and clinicians, absence or access to Aboriginal health resources, oral health workers or cultural workers, and lack of involvement of the Aboriginal community. So what is our role as dental professionals to assist in closing the gap and helping them overcome these issues? Remember, we're not saviors, we're here to assist. So, and give people the right tools. So firstly, we need to undertake cultural awareness and responsive training regularly. We need to be aware that cultural competency is never fully achieved. It's a lifelong learning lesson and it needs to be regularly undertaken. Employ or work for Indigenous health professionals, know the names of your traditional landowners and know your community. Use First Nations made resources, including oral hygiene resources, smoking resources, dietary resources. Engage your local AMS for referrals. So for medical referrals, for diet referrals, for GP referrals. Make sure you have that connection. And also respect that First Nations people need patience and time to build trust. So to appropriately engage First Nations people, we need to build that trust and rapport. Just have a yarn, just have a chat, listen. You don't have to jump in and think that everyone needs to be treated the same in terms of how we treat someone. We need to realize they all come from different areas and backgrounds, and they all have different experiences, especially in dental. So here are some resources that I would recommend. So oral health resources, including Mob Smiles and the Deadly Choices program. So I'll pass these on so they're available to you as also. So thank you for having me. I hope you're able to learn something beneficial today. And finally, here's my references.
Kelly, thank you very much indeed for that phenomenal start to our webinar this evening. A great grounding to start with as well, which has been fantastic. Hopefully we'll get, I'm pretty certain we'll get lots of discussion towards the end, so don't run away. We'll have those discussions later on, which will be good. But thank you very much indeed for kicking us off this evening. Our next speaker, as I look on my run sheet, is from the Melbourne Dental School. It is Dr. Rita Hardiman. And Rita, I shall hand the baton over to you.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks, Kelly. That was actually really confronting how wide-ranging those initial government interventions were, that still affecting lives today. Yeah, it's that blew me away. But I think I'm going to blow people away. I've blown myself away with this, and I think I'll yes, some of those statistics you brought up, Kelly, are going to be quite interesting when you look at my presentation. So I took a much more personal approach. One of the things I'm interested in my work is to figure out the effects on people of life events and things that we do in our lives. Usually that focuses on mineralized tissues, but today I will be focusing on sugar intake and using myself as a little bit of a guinea pig. So if you can all share, you see my screen, I will talk to you about how much sugar. Okay, let's just see if I can advance that screen. Yes, so bringing it back to those World Health Organization guidelines. So as Kelly mentioned, we should be reducing our daily free sugar intake to less than 10% of our energy intake. And for an adult, that's about 50 grams. A further reduction to below 5% would be even more beneficial. So that's roughly 25 grams or 6 teaspoons per day. And free sugars refers to monosaccharides such as glucose and fructose, and disaccharides such as sucrose or table sugar. And that's added to foods and drinks by manufacturers, by cooks or consumers. And it's also sugars that are naturally present in honey and syrups and fruit juices and fruit juice concentrates. So I went a little further than that, and I also added things like lactose. So anytime sugar appeared on an ingredients list, I measured it. And I did this by using a scale. So I weighed everything that I was eating for a week. It's actually quite time consuming and fiddly. I calculated all the sugar content, so all the free sugars that were in the food, whether added or not. And I added the same weight of sugar that I was eating to a big jar every day, just so that I could see what that looked like. And I also converted that to a teaspoon measurement, because I think sometimes cognitively that's a bit easier to accept. And I didn't modify my food intake at all. So I don't usually drink soft drinks anyway. And I don't, I didn't think that I ate so many sweet things. I didn't think there would be too much sugar in my diet, but, we'll find out, won't we? So I looked at a lot of nutrition panels. Nutrition panels were a daily friend for me for that 1 week, calculating everything. And I usually measured things per, if I was looking at something, I did actually look at whether it was more than 10% sugar content. Sometimes it was, a lot of times it wasn't. So the first day, this was and don't worry, this is not day on a plate. I'm not going to take you through 7 days of my entire food intake. It gets shorter as we go along, but I just thought I'd point out that these were the things in red are the things that contain sugar in that day. So there's a bit of fruit in there. There's a bit of jam in there, and I put a picture of the scones that I ate on the screen. That's a side plate, so it's a little small bread plate. So these scones weren't even as big as the palm of my hand, so they weren't overly big. I think what eventually did me in was the chocolate cake with ice cream, unfortunately. And this is how much sugar was in each of those things. So 14 grams of sugar in the banana and 26 in the grapes, and then 18 or roughly 18 grams of sugar in the jam. So right there is about what my daily sugar intake should be or could be up to. But then, of course, there was more, including the whopping 39.1 grams of sugar in chocolate cake and ice cream. And it was not a big serving. I should have taken a photo of that. And this is what it looked like in the jar. So the daily count for day 1 was 116 grams and 29 teaspoons of sugar, dividing that by 4, which was a lot more than I thought. And it was a lot more than I expected. And I thought maybe that's an aberration. Maybe it'll be different on the second day. Day 2 was a Sunday. It was footy day, and I had 3 lolly snakes that were being handed out, yes, to the children playing football. And the rest is roughly the same. Probably the big surprise in there was the bolognese sauce, and it contained sugar because it contains a lot of tomatoes. So this was day 2. Day 2 was 103 grams or 26 teaspoons, still a lot higher than I thought. And then on day 3, I thought I'd cracked it. I thought at least it's under 100 grams. So remember, I wasn't trying to reduce my sugar intake. I was simply measuring it. So I wasn't changing what I ate at all. But I had a meat pie for dinner and I added 22 grams of sauce, which pushed me over the 100 grams. So about a teaspoon worth of sugar in that 22 grams of sauce. So day 3 looked like this, 102 grams. So I'm already, day 3, about half the jar was full. And this was about, I think the jar was about 750 mils in volume. I did crack the 100 grams on day 4, just by accident. So it did happen eventually. And then this is where I'm going to call on the panel for a bit of audience participation, or not panel participation, I guess, because I took a little trip to the supermarket and took some photos of some of the aisles. So remember, I don't drink juice. I didn't buy any juice, but I did pick out some juices that looked interesting. So we have an orange juice with no pulp. We have a pear, mixed berry and banana juice. And we have a spinach, zucchini and kale juice. So out of those 3, what do you think? What had the most sugar?
Do you want us to chime in?
Yeah.
I'm going to go with the pear, mixed berry and banana.
Uh-huh.
I'll
Oh,
go with the
actually,
spinach. I'd go with the orange juice.
All right, let's have a look, shall we? So you're both about right. So 8.4 grams per 100 ml of the orange juice, 8.9 for the pear, mixed berry and banana juice, and still 5.6 for the spinach, zucchini and kale. I suspect that's, I've forgotten now, but I think it's probably got apple juice in it to sweeten it. But of course, this is per 100 ml. That's 100 mils. So a serving size of these juices is actually 250 mils. I almost couldn't get it in the glass, but if you're drinking a cup of this juice, which is a serving, you're upping your sugar intake to 21 grams or 22 grams or 14 grams, even for the spinach and kale juice. So its serving size is really, really important when you're looking at this. It might not be quite up to 10%, but if you're drinking a lot of it, then the numbers go up really high. The next aisle was the condiment aisle, because it's just a bit of a contrast, really. So I picked out some mustard pickles, some oyster sauce, some corn relish, and some Worcestershire sauce, just because everyone likes saying the name. So again, we have a question. So per 100 grams or 100 mils, how much sugar do you think is in the corn relish?
25.
25?
But actually, it's probably a bit higher.
I think 30,
30?
maybe.
I was
Corn's
gonna
pretty
say
sweet.
that. Yeah, I was going to say something like 30, 35.
Interesting, because it's actually 18.9 grams. But when you look at the ingredient list, the first ingredient is water, the second ingredient is sugar. So it's basically sugar water with a few other things in it. Mustard pickles was 16.8, a little bit similar. What about Worcestershire sauce? What do you think? 20?
25.
25?
I'd say 10, but I cook with Lancashire sauce, given where I come from.
It is 18.8. They're all very similar so far. But again, first ingredient is water. Second ingredient is vinegar for Worcestershire sauce, but third ingredient is brown sugar. And lucky last, oyster sauce. What do you think? Is it less or is it more?
25 again.
20.
I'm just going to stick with 25.
It's got to be right one time.
I think it's less.
I think 15. Yeah, I think
15? It's a whopping 28.6.
Oh, wow.
So again, yep. Second ingredient is sugar. The first one is water. So it's again, you know, you're not going to drink 100 mils of oyster sauce, I doubt, but still it's an important consideration. A lot of this stuff is added sugar for consistency or flavor or to balance a flavor. So I kept going through all this with all this in mind. And I have to say, it started a lot of conversations at my house, people holding food up to me saying how much sugar is in this. And, you know, not that I wanted to start some obsession about measuring sugar, but it's just interesting when you see it. So with all my efforts, well, which actually was no effort because it was an accident, of going below 100 grams on day 4, I really, you know, upped my intake on day 5 to 114 grams. So there weren't any huge changes in diet, just a lot of added or incorporated sugar and lots of sugar in fruit. Day 6 was 77 grams, and I suspect it was just a really busy day and I actually ate less rather than decreasing the amount of sugar. Day 7 was 105.4 grams. And that's what the jar looked like at the end. I was lucky that was just pure luck that it ended up filling the jar completely. So as a total, it was 716 grams of sugar over that week. 716 grams is 180 teaspoons. It is an entire jar full of sugar. It weighs slightly more than a basketball, slightly less than an Eastern European hedgehog, and about the same as half of a human brain. So just to put it in perspective, it's a lot of sugar and it took me completely by surprise. So the next step is now to try and reduce my intake, and next year I might do the same thing with salt. So thank you very much. It was, yeah, something I didn't expect and something which actually was pretty shocking in the end.
Rita, thank you very much for a very shocking presentation on top of the confronting presentation that we had from Kelly. And I think those of you that are logged in for the webinar can see the problem that we're talking about this evening, and the challenging problem that it is for us to manage and to deal with. In the interest of time, I'm sure we will have large discussions around the amount of sugar in terms of basketballs and the potential health risks of that, and the fact that I can't guess how much sugar is in half the food that's in my cupboard. But we're going to move forward to our next speaker from the Melbourne School of Global Population Health, which is Professor Rob Moody, who's going to talk about the insidious role of sugar in our way of life, building on what has just been 2 outstanding and quite confronting presentations so far. Rob, over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yeah, it's lovely to follow Kelly and Rita. You both, in a sense, already started to show how insidious this is. I'm just trying to. So, I mean, just to build on what Kelly and Rita have said, really is the fact that sugar is both very overt in our lives and very covert in our lives. It's amazing contradiction in the terms. This is my local convenience store. I mean, it is just wall-to-wall sugar. And then when I go up to buy something, it doesn't matter what it is, there's about 3 bananas on the side. Then they will offer me would I like to double it or triple it, and buy even more sugar at a cheaper rate. And as I show, this is how these businesses work, and how we have this sort of whole. Kelly talked very, very eloquently about the social determinants of health. Well, this is around one of those huge social determinants, which is now really starting to I guess, take our attention around the commercial determinants of health. This is how corporations act to basically addict nations. And they're doing a pretty successful job in the US, and they're doing a pretty successful job in Australia. This is another one, building on what Rita's just said about a barbecue sauce. It has between, it depends on how you measure it, say like 125 teaspoons in 9. I mean, that's just sugar. I mean, and this is how it's been hidden. And Rita's shown that, I think, really well about virtually how it's been hidden in our lives. And, you know, I have to admit to being an absolute, I don't have a sugar tooth, I have a sugar brain. And I don't know why, in a sense, teeth have copped the rap for this. It's obviously our brains that have been utilized here, and particularly by the companies. I mean, basically, as you know, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. They're looking for energy constantly. Sugary foods provide an excellent source of energy. So sweet foods are pleasurable. So it's built into our innate brain system that to survive as a species, then we like sweet things. The point is, we have not adapted very well, given the fact that for so many people, we don't have to go out and actively search for food. It's there, and it's presented in ways that are extremely attractive. The debate around, is this addictive? Well, I mean, it's pushing on, it produces cravings, produces withdrawal, produces tolerance. You know, it's moving very much towards a notion of, okay, if it isn't physically addictive, it's verging on that in my view. And just, it's interesting, not being from the sort of oral health traditional faculty, but it really is staggering. I mean, what is in a sense, the most prevalent medical condition in the globe, and the least attended to really in public policy terms, and untreated dental caries? I mean, the fact that it produces so many, and I just cannot understand why, or in a sense, this continues to be the case, given that, you know, our mouth, our teeth is the portal for virtually everything we eat, but also everything we do. So I came across this quite interesting history of sugar, and I just love the way that they talked about it. It seems that no other substance occupies so much land for literally, and so much part of our planet's surface for so little benefit to humanity. So it's a food which we didn't need, but we all crave. Has been actually instrumental in the modernization of the world, and really underpins the development of the whole slave trade. I mean, it has a major impact on the way that our world has developed. So again, it's taken this incredibly important part of our lives, and in this instance, been a fundamental part of the way that commerce has worked in Australia, in the world. I just wanted to point out the fact that in other illnesses, we think about the vectors of illnesses, whether it's in tuberculosis, or whether it's in HIV, or whether it's in malaria. We don't often name the industrial vectors of the non-communicable diseases that we're seeing now. And obviously, they are the ultra-processed food corporations that have sugar so high on their agenda, or it's tobacco, or it's the alcohol. We fundamentally need to start to measure and introduce public health surveillance of their activities, not just in the sense how much sugar we're eating, but how much marketing they're doing, you know, and to whom are they doing, and how much are they spending on it, and how much are they spending on political donations, and how much are they spending on lobbying. And these are the sorts of things that we really do need to start to understand. And Kelly mentioned the importance of sugar-sweetened beverages, how Coca-Cola can, you know, how they achieve global dominance. Well, they spent $4 billion on advertising their products annually for those 6 years. And it's interesting, many years ago, when I was working in HIV, we talked to the head of Coke in Africa about putting the red ribbon on their can. And he basically said, well, look, thanks very much. We'd love to, but we're just 90% sugar and water. And they are, that's all that, sorry, it's 10% sugar and water and 90% marketing. So it's, you know, we don't want any disturbance of our marketing. And, you know, the fact that they can make so much money, the fact that they can produce an impact of, for example, if you look in Mexico, the impact of Coca-Cola is quite extraordinary. It's a lovely film called El Susto. Well, it's rather heartbreaking, but the impact that Coca-Cola has had on the development of diabetes in Mexico is quite profound. I'll just quickly play this because this is just a short video interview of a Coca-Cola executive.
James Quincy is the president of Coca-Cola Europe. What good does Coca-Cola do you physically? I think Coca-Cola, as the introduction said, does have some sugar in it. It is energy. Is it an absolute necessity? No, it's not. Millions of people enjoy it as part of their diet across the UK. Does have some sugar in it, you say? Why don't you say specifically how much sugar there is in this can, for example? I think if you you're on the side, you say 30, you have a percentage on there, don't you? Yes, right here on the front, it quite clearly calls out the amount of sugar in this can of Coke. And what 35 grams, which is 6 teaspoons of sugar, which is, you know, about the same amount of calories as a cappuccino or half a croissant. So there is calories. And actually, what we're doing is to say, look, the information is here. We want to actually promote and make sure. Do you imagine people know if they go to the cinema, and they get, this is a small one, and there are big ones here too. You go to the cinema and you get a jug of Coke like this. Do you think people have any idea how much sugar's in it? And maybe they don't. And I think one of the things we need to do. Look at this. 23 sachets of sugar in that single container, the equivalent thereof. Now, that is a staggering amount of sugar, isn't it? That is why we're very focused, as one of the things we're doing, on getting the information out there. We're not trying to hide the information behind what's in a Coca-Cola Classic. But there's zero sugar in a Coke Zero. Well, clearly, it's called a Coke Zero. But a Coke Classic, look at this one here. There's 44 packets of sugar in this one. 44! Indeed. And I think what we're saying is, look, we want to make sure that people have the information available to them so that they can make the choices. And if they don't want the big one, they're fine. And that clearly is not one that's going to be for everyone. We want to make sure the information is available. We want to make sure there's more availability. Okay, we'll move on if we can. Sorry. But just, I guess the point about that is really just to show how hidden so much of the sugar content of the foods that we have, yet they're so brilliantly advertised. Not only are they brilliantly advertised, it's to whom do they actually advertise? And you can see here, you know, the average Australian kid has so much exposure to unhealthy food advertisements, most of which have sugar in them on television each year, let alone other forms of advertising. And they really focus on areas where in lower socioeconomic environments. So they know where to target, where perhaps people have less education, less income. They know this is a focus on lowest, you know, even for train stations in the lower socioeconomic areas. We know that they do that globally as well. I mean, this is a lovely case of Nestle, how they literally sugarcoat their health stars. So they'll say, yes, you know, sugar and skim milk, 4.5 stars, it's actually got 1 star. And the fact that Nestle have been sort of pushing this out in a way where they've then been great supporters of sports. Why? Because, and in Australia, it's been Milo Cricket that they've underbid. This is a case, I think it's available in 53 countries, 37 of these countries, they've been supporting physical education campaigns. Why? Because they want to take the focus off diet and put it onto physical activity. That's the problem. You know, watching the way that Nestle, Coca-Cola, Pepsi work is quite extraordinary in the way they can manipulate
our knowledge and in a sense produce what's called a form of ignorance, so that we really don't know what's going on, and they're incredibly good at doing it. Here's a ripper. I mean, here's a one where, I don't know if any of you have had Monster cans, but it's all energy and sugar. And just read this: that we put the camo pattern on our new Monster Assault can because we think it looks cool. Plus, it helps fire us up to fight the big multinational companies who dominate the beverage business. This is owned by Coke. I mean, this is just extraordinary that they will literally lie in your face to convince you otherwise. We'll leave the politics to the politicians and just doing what we do best. Oh, please. I mean, come on. They're sitting there talking to the politicians all the time. They live in the corridors of power. I mean, it's awful. This is what's happening globally. This is some of our work where we've been looking at sales of ultra-processed beverages and foods. And where do they go? They're going straight to very large, lower middle-income countries, the Indias, the Chinas, where this is where they know where business is growing. Because in high-income countries, it's starting to flatten out. Fortunately, it's still with huge levels of overconsumption anyway, but they're heading straight for the large, the Indonesias, the Brazils, where they know they can make an enormous amount of money. And this is their International Food and Beverage Alliance. I mean, these are very powerful players. Coca-Cola, Danone, Ferrero, Mars, Kellogg's. Some are private, some are publicly listed. But again, the power that they have is quite extraordinary. And here's a way of looking at this that's just been produced by Anna Gilmore and colleagues in the new Lancet series on the commercial determinants of health that I've been involved in. And I mean, it's a really interesting model. If you look here at the norms, then the norms of behavior that they're underpinning to, in a sense, to make consumption of ultra-processed foods and sugar-sweetened beverages a norm, they're influencing policies that are very favorable to them by virtue of their influence on politicians, by virtue of them contributing to corporate social responsibility, to funding some government programs. Then they're buddies of the politicians. And I know in Australia, because I've literally sat around the table when they are trying to influence policy, and they still sit, the tobacco companies can't, but these guys still sit around the national policy table, and they should not be there. Why? Because they produce ineffectual national policies, which allows them to basically market and sell as much as they can, which then produces the externalities. The externalities is that all the diabetes, we've just been talking about, the dental caries, the cardiovascular disease, the cancers that the diabetes that this produces. And of course, who pays for that? On the right side, we pay for it. The individuals and the state pay for it. Because we pay for it, then there's less money in the state coffers to actually provide other care. Meanwhile, looking in the blue side, they're making more and more money, they're building their profits, they're building their coffers, they can have even more influence on government. So we've really got quite a pathological system at the moment. And this is something that, and Matt will be talking about in a minute, but how we can start to interrupt and disrupt this really very unhealthy system that exists not only in sugar-sweetened beverages or in ultra-processed foods, but obviously in other areas like tobacco, fossil fuels, and alcohol. And if you are interested, then really do go to the new Lancet series on the commercial determinants of health. On that note, just as Rita points out, you'll find sugar wherever you look. It's there. Thanks very much.
Rob, thank you very much indeed for that. Building on what we've heard so far this evening, it becomes a more concerning picture by every 15-minute talk that we've got. And this leads on to our final speaker of the evening, which is Associate Professor Matt Hopcraft, to actually look now at what policy levers we can have to shift sugar consumption, which I think is a a really good way to round off our 4 presentations and to kickstart our discussion later on. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alistair. And look, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that we're here during the start of NAIDOC Week too, celebrating the history, the culture and the achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Really great 3 presentations that I think lead in nicely to some of the things that I want to say. And I want to start by just kind of reinforcing this really important point, and I'll come back and revisit this. But it's something that we forget sometimes. Sugar causes tooth decay. Sugar causes caries. It's not uncontroversial. We've known it for decades. All of the evidence tells us this. When we increase our sugar consumption, we get an increase in tooth decay at a population level, at an individual level. And when sugar consumption decreases, and it very rarely does, but the images on the chart there are during World War II, when there was a significant drop in sugar production and consumption, there was not surprisingly a mirror in the reduction of tooth decay. So we know that. We've heard about the World Health Organization and the evidence that's been presented through there. Reducing your energy intake to less than 10% of your total energy intake with sugars for sort of optimum health around a range of different factors, but ideally trying to get it below 5%, which is about 6 teaspoons a day or 25 grams. And like Rita said, I think talking in teaspoons makes it easier for people to understand. And the small Coke that you get at McDonald's has 6 teaspoons of sugar in it. So if you have a small Coke and go into McDonald's and see how few people order the small Coke, they always get the medium or the large, you're already over that limit. And I think the reason that it's important that we reinforce this bit about sugar causing caries is that we get distracted a little bit around talk of prevention through toothbrushing and prevention through the use of fluorides, which are really important things. It kind of goes to what Rob was saying before about, you know, using sport to distract, using physical activity, and that's the kind of way that we distract around obesity and type 2 diabetes. You know, if we're doing something healthy, if we're doing physical activity, then it doesn't matter what we eat. And it's the same with sugar. If we focus a lot on the brushing and the flossing and the fluorides after we've eaten all the sugar, then we can prevent decay. But really, and I think as Kelly kind of highlighted really nicely, the historical record tells us if we don't have sugar, we don't have tooth decay. And so that's the area that we're going to get the biggest impact on, is reducing the amount of sugar. And I think as the evidence tells us, and as Rita's nice little experiment tells us, it doesn't take too much effort to be consuming way too much sugar. And it's why we see the problems that we see. 1 in 3 kids in Australia with tooth decay by the age of 5 to 6 in their baby teeth, and it's about 40% in kids aged 12 to 14 by the time they hit in their adult teeth by the time they hit 12 to 14. So it's one of the most significant health problems that's affecting our kids and our adults. So my focus tonight is to kind of talk about policy levers to reduce sugar consumption. And the reason that I want to focus on policy is, as Rob sort of alluded to, and Kelly, commercial determinants of health. It's like a lot of public health, I think, we hear the personal responsibility crowd piping up and telling you that the best way for us to improve our health is to leave it to individuals to decide and let individuals work out what's best for them. But what decades of research tells us across multiple fields of health is the personal responsibility isn't the solution. And Rita's little experiment, and this is not a dig at Rita's personal responsibility, what it shows is that someone who thinks that they're, you know, not doing too badly can very quickly get to 100 grams of sugar without even trying. And so it's the fact that people are consuming so much sugar and not realizing it in most cases that complicates this whole issue. And if we do leave it to individuals to navigate, then we end up with the problems that we have now. Well, we've probably got very little chance of improving oral health at that population level. And part of that, I think, is because we have the illusion of choice and control over our lives. We all think that we control everything in our life, but the reality is that we probably really don't. And if we take advertising as our first example, and Rob talked about advertising, the amount of money that you know Coke and Pepsi spend, and then you multiply that by all of the other multinational companies out there, they spend all of that money because advertising works. We know that advertising works, and if it didn't work, they wouldn't spend billions of dollars each year trying to convince you to buy their product or to use more of their product and to keep buying their product. And we know that the advertising and marketing budgets of these multinational food companies far exceed anything that government and others can spend on health promotion campaigns. So any little message that we have out there that is a positive message is just completely overwhelmed and dwarfed by what we see in these negative, these unhealthy food campaigns. So invariably, we see significantly more content that's promoting unhealthy foods and unhealthy drinks, and we don't see anything in that healthy space, which means that the scales are really heavily weighed in favor of making unhealthy choices. And the companies that are doing this are really clever. I mean, they're spending billions of dollars. They're employing really smart people to do their marketing. They associate themselves with sport, as Rob has shown, but as the advertising on the screen here is showing. And that's to give their products a veneer of health. Because I know that, if my sporting idol, or if my kids growing up, if their sporting idol is eating McDonald's, or they've got a bottle of Coke in their hand and then they run out and they kick 10 goals, or they score the winning runs in the Ashes to put the sword to the English, then how can that food possibly be unhealthy? Because, oh, look, Alice is coming back on screen. He heard something about the cricket. So we know that, that they're being quite clever about this, because kids believe what they see with their heroes and their idols. So this is a really important policy lever that we need to be tackling in this insidious relationship between junk food and sport. And we know that it works, because when we tackled sports, tobacco sponsorship in sport years and years and years ago, and it took a long time and a lot of effort to do that, but we started to see improvements in decreasing the rate of tobacco smoking. And it's why we're seeing very similar action right now, and particularly what we've seen announced in the last couple of weeks around gambling advertising linked to sport. So we know that tackling advertising is really critical. And it's not just sport. This one annoys me. My office looks out over a train station, and I can see all of the advertising at the train station. It's constantly changing. But the amount of publicly owned infrastructure that advertises and promotes unhealthy food and drink it's outrageous. And it's a simple policy lever for government, because all they need to do is say, we stop this. We'll stop accepting advertising revenue from junk food companies, and hopefully improve health and oral health for people, because the money that they're making isn't anywhere near enough to cover the health expenditure that they invariably end up with as a consequence of all of this unhealthy food and drink that we're consuming. So I think that that's another really important area that governments have within their control to quite easily do. Tackling sponsorship in sport is a little bit more problematic, but we're seeing those actions occurring. The next one that I think is a really important policy lever, and this sort of goes back to a lot of what Rita was talking about, is food labelling. And there's a couple of aspects to food labelling that I think are really important. Now, I don't know if anyone had Cocoa Pops for breakfast this morning. I know that Rita didn't, and certainly not after the week that she had. And I'm assuming that probably not too many people did, because people know, and people generally know, that Cocoa Pops isn't the healthiest way to start the day. Even if they're marketed as just like a chocolate milkshake, and that's quite clever, because a milkshake it's milk, it's kind of healthy, right? So it's probably not so bad for you. But according to the food label, a serve of Cocoa Pops for breakfast contains about 10 grams, nearly 11 grams of sugar. So it's about half of our 6 teaspoons a day. And that's probably not surprising when you look at the food label. Cocoa Pops is 32% sugar. So it's a product that is 1/3 sugar. But if you dig into it a little bit more and you look at the fine print, and they're quite clever, the print is very fine. It's always hard to find that food label and read and understand it. According to the food label, a serve of Cocoa Pops for breakfast is 30 grams, or 2/3 of a cup. So the next time that you encounter a packet of Cocoa Pops in your travels, just measure out 2/3 of a cup and see how much or how little it actually is. And then if you've got kids, or you see kids eating it, or adults, see how much they actually put in the bowl. And look at the packet. I mean, the packet is a bowl that's enormous, filled to the brim and overflowing. So the marketing on the packet is telling you one thing, eat a huge bowl of this cereal. The food label says, oh, it's only got 10 grams of sugar. It's only a little bit of sugar in there, but only if you eat a really small amount of it. So it's that subtle marketing. Now let's have a look at the Nutrigrain. And Nutrigrain, it's Ironman food. It's marketed again as being healthy. It's associated with sport, but it's got exactly the same amount of sugar in a serve of Nutrigrain as a serve of Cocoa Pops, which kind of doesn't make any sense. And there's a couple of reasons for this. But Nutrigrain is 24% sugar. So it's basically a quarter sugar in our Nutrigrain, not that much healthier than our Cocoa Pops. It's a third sugar. The reason that it comes out as being the same is because they say that a serve of Nutrigrain is actually 40 grams or 1 cup. Again, I challenge anyone with kids who eats Nutrigrain to restrict them to only having 1 cup of Nutrigrain in that bowl. So we know that kids who are eating, or adults who are eating these cereals, are starting the day with significantly more than the 3 teaspoons that the label is implying that you'd be having. And then if you look at the nutrition label in a little bit more detail, and I think this is an area that we need to address and fix, but also, I think spend a bit of time trying to help and educate people to understand food labels, because it is something that drives a lot of the way that we eat. And there's 2 parts to the food label. Down the bottom is recommended daily intakes, and that's how much vitamins or minerals you should have. And there's some evidence that tells us what we should be having. It's the top that talks about percentage daily intake. And people often misinterpret that as meaning that that's a recommendation as well, that that's what we kind of should be aiming for. But it's different from what's down the bottom with vitamins, which is something that we should be aiming for. And then when you dig into it a little bit more, and it took me a little bit of time to kind of get down into the nitty-gritty of understanding this, because it's not really clear anywhere. But there's a reference value there for the amount of sugar that is in our percentage of daily intake. And there's some evidence around how much energy from fat and from saturated fat and from proteins and fibers and various other things we can get. But there's not, other than what we're now seeing with that World Health Organization piece. But up until now, there hasn't been anything really clear on sugar. So the energy reference value is 8,700 kilojoules. And someone just selected that would be a reasonable amount of energy for the average adult to have. And then when you sort of subtract away the fats and the proteins and all of the other things, you're left with something like 15 to 20% remaining that could come from sugar. So the Australian dietary guidelines say, look, somewhere between 15 and 20% of your energy can come from sugar, and that's probably not too bad. So the nutrition label calculates it on 17.5%. It gives you 90 grams a day. And we say, well, there you go. Your serve of Nutrigrain is only 11% of your daily intake. If we go back to Rita's nice little experiment, she was pretty close to 90 grams a day on most of her days. She was a little bit over on a couple of days. But according to the nutrition label and to the Australian dietary guidelines, she was, pretty much spot on with where she should have been. When now what we're seeing is that the evidence is telling us we should be well below that. So if we go with the World Health Organization's 10%, which is about 50 grams a day, as compared to what's on the nutrition label, which is currently 90 grams a day, that effectively kind of halves everything. And if we go down to the 5% or the 6 teaspoons, 25 grams a day, it really significantly changes what's on the food label. So I think that there's a really important piece of work that we need to do here on the food label around making sure that we're actually changing what that reference value for sugar actually is to align with some of this new evidence. It leads to another policy lever and another kind of bugbear of mine, which is the Health Star ratings. And this is a system that was in theory designed to make it easier to choose healthy foods. One of the problems is that a lot of the people that sat around the table designing Health Star ratings came from the food industry. And as Rob's alluded to, people in the food industry and the beverage industry wield an enormous amount of political power, and they make sure that some of these things are designed in a way that aren't going to impact on their sales. So we've seen a product like Nutrigrain, which is 24% sugar. So again, let's go back to that can of Coke, which is 10% sugar, and most of the rest of it is just water. Nutrigrain's 24% sugar. It's a quarter sugar but it gets 4 stars on the Health Star rating system because Kellogg's knows how to manipulate the algorithm. They know how to fortify it in various ways and end up with a product that's 4 stars. I think the other big problem with the Health Star rating system is it's not mandatory. So the chart that we're seeing there on the screen is showing us that, you know, most of the products actually don't carry a Health Star rating system. If you go down to the supermarket, most of your products won't carry a Health Star rating at all. If it's probably 3.5 stars or above, so in that healthy range, notwithstanding Nutri-Grain, which is not healthy, but even, you know, sort of 30 to 40% of the products with a very high Health Star rating don't actually carry them. But if they're unhealthy products with a Health Star rating of 2.5 or less, only about 15% of those carry them. So there's a really big opportunity, I think, for us to look at food labeling, making sure that it is actually telling us useful information. If we're going to fix the Health Star rating system, which we've been advocating to governments for a long, long time, then making sure that it's fit for purpose, but also when we fix it, making it compulsory on a range of products as well. And the last policy leaflet that I want to talk about is one that gets talked about a lot, a tax on sugary beverages. And it's not a new idea, it's been around for a long time, both specifically in terms of a tax on sugary drinks for more than 20 years, but more generally using price signals to shift consumption patterns on a range of different products. And taxes on sugary drinks have been applied in a range of different ways, in a range of different jurisdictions, but overwhelmingly, the evidence tells us that it works. It helps to shift behaviour. People drink less sugary products, they drink more healthy products. In the UK, where their particular version of a sugary drinks tax was levied at a couple of different levels of sugar content in drinks, it encouraged reformulation, so that shifted sugar consumption patterns as well. Unfortunately, it's really controversial in Australia, and the main reason that it's controversial in Australia is because we've got a strong sugar industry lobby, and it's particularly powerful in Queensland and northern New South Wales, where most of our sugar's grown. Interestingly, though, most of our sugar is exported, and so the impact of a sugary drink levy on the Australian sugary drink industry is probably on the Australian sugar industry is probably actually going to be quite minimal. Nonetheless, it's an important sort of barrier that we need to get over. I think it's also really instructive to look at the parallels in what we've seen in tobacco. And I think there's a lot of parallels in all of these areas around marketing and advertising, labeling and so on. But sort of more generally, because tobacco was a really big industry in Australia, and at its peak in the 1970s, Australia was producing something like 16,000 tonnes of tobacco. There were actually government regulations to support the industry and to encourage local manufacturers to use local tobacco products. So this was the government kind of propping up and supporting the local tobacco industry, until it got to the stage where the evidence was so overwhelming about the harms of tobacco that they eventually had to start to get out of it. But they also saw that there was a significant issue with a large number of tobacco farmers and small businesses who were going to be impacted by the shutting down of the tobacco industry. So we then saw governments pivot to providing financial support so that farmers could exit tobacco and transition to something else. So I think in any discussion that we have about a tax on sugary drinks, which I think is absolutely necessary, I think that there's also a consideration that we do need to have for the livelihood of people in that sugarcane industry, and how our government can support people out of that and into something that is more sustainable and more healthy for us as a population. So I think hopefully we've given a nice overview across the 4 presentations about the insidious role that sugar is playing in our health individually, in our health at a population level, the insidious role I think that corporations are playing in driving a lot of this, and some of the things that we need to be doing in our profession and more broadly across the community to be making some of the changes to get us into a healthier state. So thank you.
Matt, thank you very much indeed for rounding off the story that we've told this evening in this webinar. It's fantastic. We've got time for a discussion, and I think participants, and observing, can hopefully try and log some questions into the Q&A if they wish to, and you're more than welcome to. I'm going to get the discussion started because this is a very tricky situation. It's a very complex yet simple problem that we've got. And it's a question for all of you in a way. Kelly, you actually started by talking about the huge wallop impact that we had in terms of sugar coming into Australia with colonization and the colonial ships, and the impact that it had immediately on Indigenous and First Nations Australians here in the country. What we've seen since, has it been across all aspects of community, an insidious creep of sugar into our diet? Because that first hit, and you can see the impact that very, very quickly, as Kelly, you spoke about. But do we now just see, have we seen over the last sort of 50 to 100 years, this creep of sugar into our daily diet so that people don't really know what they're actually consuming? And anyone can start the discussion on that one, because it's quite telling to me that you've got what our religious population were hit very immediately with all this sugar, but has it crept since?
I'll jump in. I'll say I think it has. And I think one example, which is kind of, it's a different example, but I'm sure you'd find the same thing. My mother-in-law once gave me a little book of the Heinz baby food, you know, the little jars of baby food that you can buy. And this was from the 60s. And in the 60s, every single ingredient list for all of the different baby foods had added salt. And now since then, now we know like no added salt for babies, no added salt for little children. But I think you'll find the same with sugar. If you, and maybe that's the next thing I'll do. I'll have a deep dive into some older ingredient lists.
So here's one I prepared earlier, Rita.
Oh, you should have gone first.
No, I was just trying to find the slide. I did exactly that. I had a look at a range of fast food menus, and use the Wayback Machine to source old nutrition information. And you're absolutely right that products are increasing in the amount of sugar that they have in them, and part of this has been driven by as you said, salt moving out of baby products. As we started to learn more about salt, the next big thing that I think has driven a lot of this has been around fat, and fat being kind of demonized and thought to be unhealthy, and so then products have been shifting out fat. And from a food technology point of view, when you take the fat out, you have to replace it with something else, and so sugar gives you things around mouthfeel and structure and a whole lot of other things. And then when the evidence was sort of telling us, oh, you can have 90 grams of sugar a day because that's completely fine. So some of these changes were probably insidious. When Rob talked about addiction, and there's a whole piece of research around the bliss point in food, and using sugar to get people kind of more addicted to food. So there's no doubt that plays part of it. But also, I think part of it was in thinking that we're taking the fat out, and McDonald's would have marketed these as being 100% beef, lower fat, healthier than our products were previously. But in fact, what they're doing across a whole range of their products was just actually upping the sugar content, and that's one of those things that no doubt has contributed to that creeping sugar in our diet, and it will sit across product after product after product after product.
Rob,
I think it's also, sorry.
No,
there you go.
I think it's also got to do with modern society being fast paced. So things have to be quick and easy. So cereals, they're quick and easy, but we have that hit of sugar in the morning, your blood sugar spikes and you need a bit more sugar as well. So it just continues on through the day. But also, fast foods through different aspects. We're not making foods anymore traditionally. We're not having gardens and things like that. We're in a society where things are quite quick, and we're marketed to just buy a takeaway or even new foods and menu logs and things like that. But one big thing I find with a lot of clinicians and clients is the slushies. So slushies and ices and things like that, they're only $1. They're marketed to children. They have 15 teaspoons of sugar in just one icy. If they go to the slushy, it's 45 teaspoons of sugar. So it's again, I think it's manipulation, but also having that hidden aspect of sugar that people aren't aware of, because it's fast, it's easy, it's cheap, and it's affordable.
Yeah, I agree. Rob, you had a point
Oh,
there.
just quickly, I mean, Matt, I was interested to note that increase. I just wonder whether it's also associated with increasing tolerance. In other words, the population's actually got more and more used to more sugar, and to get the sort of the refined hit that we want, then you need to have more. The other point about this, I think, in terms of the demonizing of fat, has been the high fructose corn syrup approach, which is basically came in the 60s out of the US to say we've got all this corn, we're producing a lot of it, it can produce the sugars we need. It's a much cheaper way of actually providing sugar or sweeteners to sugar sweetened beverages. So that basically took over in the 1980s, and you had an active industry demonizing fat in a way that is quite incredible. The way that they've actually manipulated that at a global level is quite extraordinary.
It is quite remarkable, and I think a comment online that this is coming from one of our webinar guests is that junk food companies give very good deals to sell products. Buy a burger, get free, get a large Pepsi, get a free refill. The attraction is there as well, especially to
Supersize me, exactly.
And cost of living at the moment, it's expensive, so people can't afford to buy things to make their own foods, and it's just easier.
Absolutely. And when you I remember thinking, as you were all talking, I remember thinking back to the soccer Euro finals in 2021, which had happened in 2020. Cristiano Ronaldo was rebuked by the governing body of UEFA, of the European Soccer Federation, for when he gave an interview, moving Coke out of the way.
Great. Good on him. Yeah, it was great. It was
a role model being
a powerful move.
Absolutely, but it made the news, which was quite remarkable.
Well, it's the same as the Australian cricket team saying they don't want the energy companies to sponsor them. Yeah,
absolutely. We have a question online as well that says developing healthy relationships with food is important for preventing eating disorders and requires us to avoid assigning a moral value to food. The focus on the importance of policy change and commercial determinants of health tonight has been fantastic. But how do we best balance developing oral health messages to reduce added sugar consumption that avoid assigning a moral value to the food? Or are we best as a profession, are we best to focus our efforts on commercial and policy change? I'm going to throw that one to Kelly to start with on that one. And then all of you can contribute. That's a very, very important point, a very interesting dynamic to think about.
I think it can be both ways. Like, we do need to concentrate on policies and things like that, but also having a discussion with a patient individually is really important, and what they base their most priorities on as well. But I did actually have back in when I was a student, I had a young girl who was battling a little bit with her diet. She was a little bit overweight, but had all these dental issues as well with sensitivity. So to show her the amount of sugar, we did like a dietary log, but we also discussed frequency. So we made it more a little bit about dental as well, frequencies of sugars and acids and things like that. But then in the end, I did a little bit what Rita had done. I had got little plastic bags and shown her the amount of sugar that was actually in her diet for that week, for the diet log. And she was amazed with how much sugar she was actually consuming against the recommendations, even though Matt had mentioned we need to halve those recommendations again. And I think that really did, that visual aspect showed just how much she was needed to improve her sugar intake. And I think that really helped her hit home, but in a way that wasn't basically judging her in a way. It was more informing her and giving her the tools to make the best decisions herself.
Thanks, Kelly. Any other, Rob?
Yeah, I just think that's a really good question from Samantha. It's interesting, the more that we focus on personal responsibility, the more we fall into the trap of the corporations, because theirs is all focused on personal responsibility and the whole, moral value of choice there, and retaining freedom of choice. And the arguments they use are really very sophisticated, and they know what triggers are going to work. Because that's why I think the most important thing is to focus on the environment, and to focus on what are we selling, how much are we selling, how much are we advertising, all of those things that we pointed to, and that's why not having the ultra processed food industries around the policy table. They should be nowhere near it. They are not part of the solution. I mean, it's interesting. I know this from deep personal experience, having run the National Preventive Health Task Force in 2008, 2010. At that time, tobacco weren't allowed around the national policy table, but alcohol and food were, right? And I must admit, I thought at that time, well, yeah, well, maybe they're part of the solution, and maybe they do. I've watched them for 15 years undermine every possible effective public health approach that has been put forward. They are awful. They are powerful. They are absolutely destructive in terms of what's good in our society, and we need to keep them out.
It's funny you should say that. I remember when I was on a course years ago talking about leadership and communication. Remarkably, someone was using Coca-Cola as a way of how do you get your message everywhere. And you can go to the most remotest parts of this planet, and you can find stores in the remotest parts of anywhere in this world, and you'll find a Coca-Cola can.
Well, they're supranational. They operate above nation states, and they're hyper local. And that's, I mean, you can learn from that. But let's sort of learn about how we can disrupt their approach, and how do you get healthier foods actually at that level. Yeah.
So just following on that, sorry, Matt, you're going to say something.
Oh, well, I mean, I was going to agree wholeheartedly with Rob. I mean, these food corporations exist with one purpose in mind, and that's to sell more product and figure out smarter and cleverer ways to sell more and more of their product, because that's just what companies do. I think sort of to Samantha's question, I think it's a both. That, so as a profession, however we want to sort of define that, I think our best strategies are around tackling policy, because that's what we do as a collective. We tackle things at a collective. I think as individual practitioners, I think that there's definitely that opportunity to be having discussions with individual patients about what they're doing. That challenge around some of the moral stuff, I think, is really, really difficult. And I think the other thing that is really important for us to also bear in mind is that food is more than just nutrition. It's more than just something that keeps us healthy. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole piece, and I think Kelly kind of alluded to this as well, but it's the enjoyment of cooking. It's the enjoyment of sharing food with other people. It's the joy that you get from eating. Sometimes it's the necessity to eat that slice of chocolate cake at the end of the day because of the day that you've had. Like, there's a whole lot that's packaged up into all of that stuff. And so it is then a really challenging conversation for us to have around saying to people, well, you have to reduce to this, or you can't eat that, or this product's really terrible. I mean, I think there are things that we can absolutely demonize, and anything that's in a red can has no nutritional value, and I think we should have no problems demonizing that. Some of the other stuff, though, it does start to get a little bit trickier, and it makes it a little bit different from tobacco, where yes, there's no safe level of smoking, and so it's very black and white. But when we see that there's a little bit of sugar in some things, it becomes a harder conversation.
Well, maybe it's coming back to Samantha's point. It's a healthy relationship with healthy food. We're trying to look at that individual level. Yeah.
And that's the challenge, because you say, Kelly, you said people are running very busy lives. We're we're not standing still. We're going from A to B to C to D, and we're taking convenience as a way forward. I've got one last question, because we've had a phenomenal coming up for an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes of this of a presentation discussion. Is this a long slog, as it has been with tobacco? Are we looking at years of messaging, and as you say, Rob, getting these corporations away from the policy table, away from the health departments, away from influence? Are we looking at the same significant, long, hard piece of work that we've had and still have to a degree with smoking? Kelly, I'm sure you see patients that use tobacco as most practitioners probably still do. Or is this an easier or a harder challenge that we have, given the challenge we've had in the past with tobacco?
I think it would be more difficult, and it's going to be a harder slog, because they've mentioned that, with smoking there is no safe level, but with sugar we have sugar in everything that we eat, whether it's natural or not. And I think that's a harder conversation to have with everyone, and but also the amount of sugars that we have in everything as well. So I think that's going to be more difficult to take on.
Any of the thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with Kelly. I mean, I think it is, they're actually bigger. They're giants, these organizations, and they tend to be there's mergers and acquisitions that make them even bigger. So when they do that, it means they have all this disposable finance that can actually really influence international and national governments in a very profound way. And they can push them around literally because they've got that much power. And also they've learned from tobacco. They have learned, in a sense, some of the mistakes that tobacco made as an industry about being oppositional all the time. And my colleague, Jen Lacey-Nichols, done a very good study on looking at Coca-Cola around how they decided, well, we're going to be friends. We're going to work with government. We're going to be buddies. So they see us in a different light. So they have more sophisticated approaches. It just means we have to work harder at it.
And do we think there's a sports body out there that is bold enough to refuse the dollars that come from a McDonald's or a Red Can based drink or its major competitor? Is there a sporting body in Australia that will actually say refuse that sponsorship?
Yep, I mean, you go, Matt, but I mean, I know the one there's a suburban football league that said no in Victoria, and they've actually got more sponsorships from elsewhere. Sorry, Matt.
No, I was going to have to, fact check myself, but I'm reasonably certain that Netball Australia don't take a lot of junk food sponsorship or any. I'd have to check that. But the challenge, and I had this conversation with a football club, AFL football club president a little while ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, and they were much more concerned even back then about gambling, and we've part of the challenge, we've taken away the tobacco money. It should never have been there in the first place. Now we're taking away the gambling money, which should never have been there in the first place. But all these sports, the clubs, everything that's built around it is seeing is someone's taking their money away, and there'll be a point where they'll say, well, there won't be any money left. The sport will fall apart, which we know isn't true, but it does become a really difficult.
The sky will fall in. That's around tobacco, and they will exactly say the same thing as the gambling industries are saying now.
But if anyone actually had a long-term view, like a really proper long-term view, you'd say, well, if we're not spending all of our money on terrible, unhealthy food and then paying high taxes to support our health system to help us deal with the consequences of all of that terrible food, we'd all actually have some more money that we could spend on going to see our sporting team play with no sponsors on their jumper. Yeah, but none of that actually, that's the proper long-term view of the world. But how do we get to there?
Yeah, that's why you can use actually small dedicated taxes, even though treasuries hate them. But I mean, the point is, when one of these companies is sponsoring football, for example, who's paying? We are, the punter. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's built into their marketing costs. I mean, we pay for it anyway. It's we could pay for healthy promotion, or we could pay for unhealthy promotion. At the moment, we're paying for very unhealthy promotion.
One last comment before we finish. I want to throw this one to Rita, because I have to do this one because I am the head of a dental school. I am the head of an educational setup here at Melbourne University. You've undertaken a very personal piece of work to present today. Is that something we should be getting our Bachelor of Health Therapy and our DDS students to be doing as part of their program in year one of their degree program?
I think it's something you should start even earlier. It's not just an oral health student or a dental student or any sort of tertiary student. Get the year sixes to do it. Start in grade 5. They know how to measure stuff, and they'll get a kick out of it. I've got a 13-year-old who was very hawkish about my sugar intake over the last week. Every time I had put something on a plate, she'd say, "Oh, how much sugar's in that, Mum?" They're very cluey, and once they work it out, and once they've got that in their heads, I think, and it's one of those things, if they grow up like that, pretty soon they'll recognize it and they won't think sugar's cool anymore.
It's a great idea.
That's one of the huge keys, is to take away the cool factor. It worked with tobacco, largely, obviously not everywhere.
But with vaping, yeah.
Yeah, our smoking rates are down to about 14%. We can do it. It's just that it's turned into such a wicked problem, and it's and that like Rob said, the companies know this. They know why they're sponsoring junior sport. They're not silly. So let's make it obvious. Okay, you want to sponsor? Okay, let's take that McDonald's cheeseburger. It's a cheeseburger. It's a savoury item. Here's how much sugar's in that. Yeah, so start younger, not the tertiary students. Start much earlier.
I was going to say, I wonder whether one of the, what we've seen in gambling in sport in the last sort of, 12 months or so, is the requirement now for them to have the tagline that, you will lose money. So whilst they're able to promote their gambling at the moment, they're also being forced to say this is not a very good thing. Or maybe we do need the same thing in sports sponsorship, so that when they show that hamburger up on the screen, that they also show the number of teaspoons of sugar that goes with it at the same time. So
not that. I mean, yeah, you and Rob both. I'm not sure if Kelly showed one. You and Rob both showed a mouthful of disintegrating teeth. Put that picture next to it. That's much more effective.
You'll lose teeth, just like you'll lose money.
Put those photographs on cigarette packets these days and tobacco products. Maybe that is the way to go. But I'm sensing there's a potentially good engagement project here for our students to go into school. I think it's a phenomenal idea, Rita. I think that's something that
and I just, if I can say, Alistair, fabulous to have the dental school leading in this way. I think at a sort of real population health level, it's you're so well placed to do that.
Well, I think there's great opportunities with us and Rob with your school as well, with a reach out here with our practitioners, and I think especially as also Kelly with the IDAA as well, of reaching into our communities across the entire country to really start getting these positive messages across. It is 7 p.m. I've just seen my clock tick over. We've had 90 minutes of great presentations and discussions, and I would just like to thank those of you that attended this evening. Oh, we've got a question has popped in. Someone comes out. Thank you from Samantha, and thanks Samantha for joining us, and thank you everybody that has joined us on the webinar. But my sincerest thanks go to Kelly and to Rita and to Rob and to Matt for presenting and for engaging in a fantastic discussion. I'd like to thank Jackie Healy, who has helped bring all of this together to create this webinar. Thank you, Jackie, for doing that. And also for great support from T, as always with these webinars. They run immensely smoothly because of T's fantastic support behind the scenes. But thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you to my panel, and hope this has been recorded, so we'll make this available as well soon. And I can see some great projects, some interactions going forward because of what we've discussed this evening. Have a lovely evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.